Welcome back, everyone. We're doing another SCP Files Unzipped video. We're talking about our final Doctor in the series. Maybe later we'll revisit them, but this is the last one I want to talk about for now. I'm back with Keyshawn, and we're going to be talking about Dr. Alto Clef, who is pretty interesting. Yeah, literally. That's literally why his name is Dr. Alto Clef. So let's talk about Clef's history. Now, most of the fan art about Clef I don't really like because it doesn't really capture his personality as correctly as it's described. Now, I would say probably the best way to think about Clef is to think about that interaction in that Duke Till Dawn when we were doing Kondraki's video. The way he acted like overly serious, he was like, okay, he had a backup plan and a backup plan on top of it, and he was like, that fucking bastard. He's a lot more of a serious, meticulous man than a zany, wacky personality in the SCP organization, which makes him stand out because his appearance is quite the opposite. He looks pretty wacky and zany. Now, Clef himself is technically an anomalous entity for a couple of reasons. One is every single photograph of Clef cannot capture his face at all. So if you have a camera and you take a picture of Dr. Clef, a random animal head will appear like layered on top of his, like, or just replacing it entirely. So, like, if you took out your smartphone and took a picture of him, it would be like a lion head or a snake head or a fish head, blah, 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 blah. Number two, he has, well, it's speculated that he has three eyes. He's got two normal ones, and then he always wears a hat, and people assume that it's hiding another eye. This might be a rumor, this might be true, but he never takes off that hat. He also might be referred to as Dr. Clef, but I don't think he has a doctorate in anything. But he's certainly effective at his job. The other big thing about him is the reason why he's so valuable to the SCP organization is because of his last anomalous property. And that is the fact that he is immune to all cognitohazard SCPs. Which means if something can alter one of your five senses in any way, he is completely immune to it. Incredibly useful, especially when you're like around people who can make you insane or make you see shit or just completely fuck with your mind if you're just anywhere near them. And then this dude just comes strolling up with a double barrel shotgun and just goes, "No! Bonk!" But Clef is shrouded in the most mystery. Unlike Dr. Bright, where we know his father, his siblings, and pretty much his entire past and history, very little is known about Clef, which makes him kind of difficult to talk about. But what we do know is why he joined the SCP organization, what he did before that. But before like that, very little is known about Clef. What we know is mainly circumstantial at best. We know bits and pieces that we can put together to make a picture. Now, before Clef joined the SCP organization, he was part of a similar but different organization called the Global Occult Coalition, otherwise known as the GOC. Now, the GOC is very similar to the SCP organization, but instead of secure, contain, protect, they are simply about neutralize. So they're not looking to study anything. They're simply looking to get rid of and dismantle. That's what their logo looks like, by the way. I'm glad you think so. But anyway. Okay, sorry about that. Pause for a second there. But yeah, that's the logo for the GOC. The GOC is, again, it's simply about neutralizing. So if they learn about an SCP, what they're going to do, sorry, not an SCP, an anomalous entity, they're going to go out into the world and they are going to seek to neutralize said anomalous entity. And when Clef worked for them, he was known as Agent Ukulele. Because he always carries around a ukulele. Why? No one knows. He just does. Because wacky, zany personalities, I guess. But good old Agent Ukulele was subject to go and eliminate a entity called Threat Entity. Oh god, let me see if I can pull up the exact title. Threat Entity 9927-Black, otherwise known as the Goddess. Yes. Now, there has been many rewrites to both sides, like to the Goddess and to another entity that we will be talking about later that involves Clef, and Clef himself. But I'm going to give you the best version to the best of my abilities that I can give you, and inform you about the other ones without confusing you. So, Clef in his younger years fell in love. What did he fall in love with? He fell in love with a nature god that just happened to live in the same area as him. He met her when he was a teenager, and he fell in love, and later they had, he got her pregnant. Let's just say that. Years later, a child was born, and the GOC discovered this threat entity, and Agent Ukulele at the time, also Clef, was sent out to go destroy it. He spearheaded an operation called Lancelot that he was the leader in. He went out and he went to go kill his old lover, pretty much, because basically there's a threat that she was going to basically return Earth to a pre-historic age, use her goddess-like abilities to render all technology ineffective and bring it back to like a pre-technological age by degrading everything and returning it to nature, basically. Obviously, this is bad, so he went out to go do what has to be done, because that's the type of man Clef is. He's the type of man to set aside things for the greater good, for what needs to be done. But he found something he didn't expect. His old lover now had a baby with her. And he knew that the goddess had to die. But that baby did nothing wrong. So what he did was he faked his death, and he brought the baby to a convent in Ireland that he knew very personally. Now, here's where things start to split, because that baby is also an SCP. It's SCP-166. And it has two different versions. Its original version was SCP-166, the Teenage Succubus, and its new version is SCP-166, the Teenage... I don't know how to pronounce this word. It's pronounced... it's G-A-E-A. I think it's Gaia? Gaia. The old version, I think, is a little bit better written, but I think the new version fits with the lore a little bit better. I made a whole video discussing this if anyone wants to go check out this, and I'm not going to delve into it too much here on why it's not good or whatever. But basically, in both iterations of their stories, they have this anomalous property that no one learns about until someone enters the convent and discovers SCP-166, and that's when the SCP organization learns of SCP-166, and it's also when the GOC learns of 166. After they discover 166, Clef comes out of hiding, and he offers to join the SCP organization if they can keep his daughter, SCP-166, safe. The SCP organization agrees as long as Clef joins the SCP organization and basically does what they say, and they would keep her safe. Clef is not allowed any contact with his daughter whatsoever. Clef's daughter, SCP-166, is treated pretty well by the SCP organization. She basically has all the luxury she needs, not wants, but needs. She has access to a Catholic priest because she grew up in a convent. She's very religious, very nun-like, strong believer in the church, yada, yada, yada. She is curious about who her father is, but she doesn't learn about him until something happens. I'm pulling up the... Okay. So when she turned 16, Dr. Clef did something he wasn't supposed to. He left a letter for her. Here's an interaction in between Dr. Light and Dr. Clef I will read to you now, after he left his letter. Dr. Light says, "What the hell were you thinking?" Clef said, "I wanted to make sure she's alright. You wouldn't let me talk to her. I took another route." Light says, "What you did was so much worse than that. If you just stuck to throwing your weight around to get her amenities, I'm sure I could overlook that. But then you go..." I need to turn this light down a little bit because the same problem is shining in my eyes and I can barely read. I was like, what's wrong with me? "But then you go about trying to give a Class 4 anomaly a phone line to the outside world. Damn it, the council already dislikes you. Working at the same site as her. If this gets out, you can kiss whatever deal you made goodbye." Dr. Clef says, "Come on, Sophia. She's harmless. The only reason she's in there is because of me. I had to do something. The Foundation was just going to let her grow up thinking that her..." Gets cut off. Light, "Before you say another word, remember that this is public to everyone with a Class 4 clearance. I can redact your name, but I can't stop people from putting the pieces together. Putting the pieces together from an ill-timed outburst. Redacted." Dr. Clef remains silent. Dr. Bright, 16 years. 16 years where she couldn't walk through a city, or catch a movie, or just goes shopping. It doesn't matter if she's in a convent or a Foundation cell. She's being locked up for something she had no choice in. All because of me. It isn't fair." Light says, "I know." Clef says, "And I can't do anything about it. I could send a strike team anywhere in the world. I know secrets that the most powerful people in the world would pay billions for, and yet I can't even do so much as talk to her. I can't even let her know that she's not alone." Dr. Light says, "You've done the best you could. Much more than anyone could be expected of you in an impossible situation." Dr. Clef says, Funny how little that makes of a difference. Clef falls silent. Clef says, "I don't care. Just write me up. Let's just get this over with." Light says, "I'm scheduling you for 2-hour sessions with a Foundation psychologist. I'll make sure it's Glass. If he signs off at the end of it, we can expunge this from your record." Dr. Clef says, "Ugh." Dr. Light says, "Redacted." Dr. Clef says, "Yeah?" Dr. Light pauses. Clef, "Yeah, I know. Thank you, Sophia." End log. So he left a letter for her, which is like a big no-no. And the letter read, "I first met your mother when we were a little bit more than children. She had hooves for feet and starlight in her eyes. She was beauty and nature incarnate. I killed her with my own two hands. Eden isn't a place, it's a state of being. They wanted to take us back to it, and I stopped them. I took paradise away from us for a second time. I have never regretted my actions on that day, except one. That when you first met me on that day, you saw your father put a bullet in the head of your mother. I make no excuses, only an explanation. You may not have even remembered it, but I'm telling you now in the hope you understand why I did what I did. I hope you forgive me. I love you. I wish I could have done more for you. The best I could do was leave you in the hands of a kind, loving people and hope they would raise you in my place. From what I've seen, they did well. I'm sorry you couldn't stay with them. I'm sorry they brought you to this place, and I promise to do my best to make sure your stay here is pleasant. I promise to keep you safe. Happy 16th birthday from your loving father. But yes, also Clef is a alias because his previous one was Agent Ukulele. Also, Clef is I think, a chord you can play on the ukulele, if I'm not mistaken, which is why that's his name, quote unquote. He's known to not wear your traditional Foundation attire. He's pretty much always seen with a hat and a ukulele, and he typically wears a Hawaiian shirt underneath his lab coat. He tries to do his best in most Foundation scenarios, because obviously the better job he does, the better life his daughter will get. He is uniquely suited to working at the SCP Foundation, and I doubt he will ever outlive his quote-unquote use. Even if he gets old and can't do the same stuff he physically can, he is still going to be an asset to the SCP organization because of his, anomalous properties. I don't know. I think he's more likable than most of the other. If I was paired to work with any of the SCP doctors that we talked about, like Kantaraki, Bright, or Clef, I would always pick Clef. Because at least he's got the best interests at heart. Yeah. Now we'll talk about the changes made to the Goddess and SCP-166. So the Goddess has also been shoehorned into the mythos with the Scarlet King. I don't really like this because I feel like they should be kept separate, and it doesn't really make too much sense. It just feels shoehorned. Basically, they say that Clef's mother had the book that they used in order to, what's it called? Remember how when we were talking about the Scarlet King? I know this was like a month ago, but it was the book the Foundation used to create the Montauk protocol. Yeah, they said that Clef's mother had that Lily, or the Goddess, basically took that from Clef and then used that to become even more powerful. And she basically influenced oh god, I can't even remember the name of the organization. It's been so long. I remember it. The Children of the Scarlet King, in order to manipulate them into doing that ritual, using her powers to influence it. And he went to go kill her because he couldn't see her returning back to normal, and he didn't want her to hurt their own daughter. I don't really like this change. I like the change of her being just a normal nature goddess, and just there's a chance she can reduce the world back to a pre-industrialized age. That makes more sense. It keeps her in her own bubble, and it doesn't feel like it's leaning into places where it doesn't need to be. Um, with SCP-166, his daughter, she used to be known as the teenage succubus, which means like she looked like a normal girl, but she had an anomalous property where if any man laid eyes on her, they would be overcome with like this like uncontrollable lust for her body, which is kind of risque, and it's understandable why they changed it. But this also makes sense why like she hadn't been discovered for 16 years, because she lived at a convent with like all females. Very few males came in, and the male who did come in to get her was because one of the other nuns had what's it called, a boyfriend who snuck in and just happened to see her. That's why she got exposed, which makes a lot more sense because in the new version she has everything around her slowly like degrades and returns to nature within like I don't know like a 20-meter radius. So like wouldn't you find it really fucking weird if you looked at the convent and just one patch of the walls was just covered in vines and everything, but none of the rest had anything, like didn't have vines, it was just normal stone? Because like that's where she sleeps and spends the most time. Oh, she also has hooves and fucking antlers in the reworked version. Like how did she not get discovered? Like every nun at the convent was just super fucking loyal. Like in the previous versions, like only like the head of the convent had to know. Yeah, I didn't like that change. It didn't make sense. It like if you said like, oh, she was normal, and then this only started happening around her 16th birthday, which is why these organizations found out about her again. That would make sense. But no, it's just from birth she looked like a nature spirit, which is just dumb. It just doesn't make sense. Like, like what I don't know. I just don't like that change. It just doesn't make sense. It could work if it was well written, but it just feels like it was just changed to fit into like what society accepts now instead of how it was originally written. I suppose. But most things don't get, reworked. Like no one's rewriting the original Dracula and Frankenstein. Yeah, this is how it is. We remember the past for what it is. It shouldn't. You shouldn't retcon things that have already been placed. But I guess that's the good and the bad of a entirely open source like world that anyone can add to it. All right, there was an audio problem. We're back now. You guys should be able to hear Keyshawn, and it should be pretty seamless from the last footage to this footage if I edit everything correctly. But basically, what happened was I'm dumb. My input sources were incorrect, so it wasn't capturing the audio correctly. But now we should be good. So we're basically not going to do everything from fresh again. We're just going to be talking about the parts that was missed in the previous one. So first off, Keyshawn, based on what you know about all three doctors now, where would you place Clef in your favorites?
So Clef is definitely my last favorite. Not to say that he isn't good, but he's definitely my last for a couple reasons. And basically, the first big reason is because there's not like a lot on Clef. Like he's cool, but there's not a lot of stories that really accentuate that personality of him being very serious and very caring about his daughter, but wants to neutralize the SCPs. Because his mentality makes sense. Like there aren't a lot of SCPs that actually can do any good for humanity. So yeah, it makes sense. But like on the other hand, there are a lot of stories where it it doesn't take him seriously at all. Because even in the previous podcast when we were talking about Dr. Bright, it's just like, oh yeah, when he went in time back in time to kill Hitler, Dr. Clef did it instead, and it's just like, well, based off of the thing that we just heard, that I just heard, that doesn't seem like something Dr. Clef would do.
Yeah, he's a very stick to rules type of person. Do what needs to be done. Basically, work for the SCP organization in order to further support his daughter. Like it just doesn't fit like what we know about his backstory. Because basically, most people like know that like the original SCPs, like the original, well, 2 through 999, are all like the most canon. I say the most canon because it's kind of a gray area, like everything else is in SCP. And Clef's backstory fits in with 166. And 166, even though it's been rewritten, it is still one of those original SCPs. And he still slides into a glove with it because it fits him so perfectly. With that rules by the book personality, with his history with the GOC, where like he comes from that background of wanting to eliminate SCPs and basically do what needs to be done kind of attitude, because he's simply doing things for his daughter. The SCP organization needs him because the abilities that he shows and proves to others that he has. He is an invaluable resource, and he knows it, which is why he's allowed to get away with like breaking the dress code, helping out his daughter. It's because the SCP organization basically they need him, and he needs them to protect his daughter.
Right. Which I think is an interesting dynamic. I just wish there were more stories that kind of would show that sort of dynamic.
Yeah. It's a problem with like having things be open sourced. It's a blessing and a curse because then anyone can make a story about it. But if anyone's making a story, if someone doesn't know the characters of like each individual doctor that they want to throw in there, just have a little bit more personality, it kind of breaks their characters, and that's a
Um,
problem Clef falls into a lot.
so we had an original conversation about open source, and I was kind of rambling. So I kind of want to make this one a little bit more concise. I find that open source thing is kind of like the comics problem, where if you have a specific character written and you want to make something like my biggest problem with the SCP thing is the fact that it's like, since it's open source, literally you could make up anything, within reason. Because it does go through a vetting process. But you could legit make up a whole bunch of
Yeah, but
crap.
its vetting process is pretty much just a popularity contest.
Yeah,
Like
that's
it's not
true.
about like
But
it's not like critiqued. It's just if enough people say, "Yeah, let's make this a thing," then it becomes the thing. Which like you think about like the type of people who would care about like voting on such a thing, and so it's a fairly decent vetting process for the SCPs themselves. But there's a ton of like tales and open based stories about it, and I don't think that tales themselves get vetted. I'm not sure about that though.
I'm not sure about that either. But then that kind of brings up another problem. I personally, I understand the idea of a vetting process being on popularity. I think it needs to be on popularity and consistency. Because here's the thing, right? One of the biggest problems with a lot of you're gonna get a lot of hate for this if you if this ever blows up. But one of the biggest problems with like Zack Snyder movies is that they're not, like, DC comic movies are not consistent within their own world. Like, there'll be obvious like errors that come up with it, and that's just a lack of planning. So I think it needs to be a consistency and a popularity thing, because here's the thing: if you're going to make a very specific character in them written in a very specific way, you need to have stories that fit that mold.
Yeah,
And that's still open source. It's just that you're being consistent with the open source.
yeah,
Like
and
if I had a character, like if
anyone
I made a character that was like, oh, this character acts like this, that, and the other thing, and it was all open source, I would still want that character, the stories written about that character, to be about that. So you have to have a reason to why they're like that.
Yeah, anyone can make like write anything, but like that's why I really want to see like a TV show or a movie or like an actual like story based game based around SCP or like the SCP organization, something made by like a team who cares about like the product they're creating. That way they can create something that really follows the characters. If it's made by someone who truly cares about the source material, where you can follow these characters along in their gray lives, like the SCP organization is, instead of every character being like a zany character, like Dr. Bright, have characters be zany or a foil or have a motive where the characters aren't just in there just to be like a spice of personality, being in there because they're important characters to the SCP organization themselves and showing how they would interact with SCPs and each other.
One of the best examples of this is there is a Simpsons episode, very popular one, arguably one of the most popular ones, called Homer's Enemy. I believe that's the title of it. And basically, the guy is just a 100%. He's a serious dude. He worked his way up the corporate ladder. He lives in a sucky house that's like under a bowling alley and crap like that. And he's like, he does all this work, and basically, the whole episode is just like him saying that it's like, I do all this work and my life sucks. You don't do any of this work and your life is great. You got wife, 3 kids, a car, a big house, like a pretty decently sized house, and you work in one of the most dangerous jobs but well-paying jobs in the world. And that whole time, the guy is just a foil to Homer. He's a very straight laced character up until the end. Like he's a very straight laced character, and sometimes you need that.
Yeah, I think Clef really grounds what the SCP organization is. He adds a drop of seriousness to an otherwise like insane radical world. Even though like his physical abilities, like the fact that if you take a picture of him, a random animal head just appears in the photograph, or the fact that he's immune to cognito SCPs, the fact that he's working for a reason, for a purpose that is greater than himself, something he can ground himself with, makes him an essential part to stories about the SCP organization, but he's used as more of a joke or just a blend of character. I feel like I'm repeating what I'm already saying, but Clef is a serious character. That's how he should be written, but most people don't see him in this way. They see him the way the different tales about him are written, where he's just another crazy member of the cast, where that's not really who he is or what he's trying to be. It's why, again, in my SCP D&D one shots, I have him be this more serious person. He's the type of person to get things done. He's not the crazy Dr. Bright. He's not the eccentric Kondraki. He's the person who is working for a purpose. He wants to do what's best for his daughter. And why would he do these things that so recklessly go against what the O5 Council want if it could mean his daughter, you know, losing her SCP status and getting sent out into the world and having organizations like the GOC or other organizations get a hold of her? Or even worse, what if it leads to her termination by the SCP organization? He's pretty much
Yeah, that's
under the SCP organization's thumb, so it doesn't make a lot of sense for him to be this wacky personality.
I think one of the big things is that like Clef is needed in the SCP, not just like as a, not just like in the fictional world that is the SCP organization, but like you need Clef in order to make sure that the SCP has a good balance of how dangerous these things can be. Because I feel like with a lot of jokey SCPs, yeah, it's good to have fun, but like at the end of the day, the original purpose of the SCP organization was the fact that it's a horror fiction. And horror needs to have some sort of to it, so and it doesn't actually have to be like horrifying. It could just be like very sad. It Horror doesn't necessarily mean that it has horror means that it has to scare you, but like just because it scares you doesn't mean like jump scare or like oh, it's just frightening. It's like because the idea sometimes is frightening, and you need to have Clef in order to have that kind of weight of seriousness behind it.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like if you had more stories with Clef, more stories with here's a perfect example. Dr. Bright, his final the story that takes place in the future, where it's basically an existentialist, where he's basically an existentialist and he has nothing left to live for. He just draws black holes
It's
all
called
day. Like,
The Peculiar Case of Custodian Woodworth and Dr. Bright.
yeah, yeah, it's like that's a perfect horror story because it's both sad and frightening at the exact same time. Because it's just like it's sad because you know how Dr. Bright used to be, and it's horrifying because it's like it's like that subtle fear of age, like getting older, and it's brilliant. It's pretty decent. It's pretty decently structured and sad as heck, but yeah, it's something to like there's more to the surface of it.
Yeah.
There's more than the surface. I feel like people don't like Dr. Clef because there's more to the surface and he's harder to write.
Yes.
I don't like Dr. Clef simply because there's not enough for me to like him about. Not enough for me
You haven't
to
seen him in
like him.
enough situations or stories where you can latch on to who he is.
Yeah, because like I like a lot of deep interesting Marvel characters, like DC comics and crap like that. I love characters who are deeper than they actually seem to be, like Hulk. Like a lot of people just look at Hulk like, oh yeah, Hulk is just some big brute and that's about it. But if you really peel back the surface, it's like, nah, there's more to it. And the Hulk is actually pretty sad as a story. But but yeah, it's a hard thing to write. No one's gonna deny that. But just because it's a hard thing to write doesn't mean you default to, you know, the comfortable thing.
I'm sure there's popular stories that are like actually well written about Clef. They're just buried under a lot of mediocre comedy tales.
One of the greater examples is when the Three Jokers came out. And the Three Jokers is a great example of like writing something kind of deeper. I'm not gonna go into a rant about like, oh, this is what the Three Jokers means, but it's an interesting story. It takes place of in 3 issues, and basically each one of the Jokers kind of has their own personality to them. One of the more interesting ones is like Old Man Joker. I guess that's what they call him, the original Joker from the golden age of comics where the Joker wasn't like really, funny.
Mm.
He was just a guy. He was just a criminal. He was just a guy who killed people. But one of the bigger things is like that Joker never smiled really through those comics. He was just very, very serious the entire time. And then he would laugh sometimes. And then he would tell Batman, it hurts to laugh. It hurts me laughing. And it's just like, you know what? Just that simple thing just brings so much to his character because you wouldn't expect the Joker to say that, like at all, knowing the Joker. But it was such an interesting thing. It's like, I guarantee you, like characters like that aren't easy to write, but it's worth it to write.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of like opportunities that Clef and Bright can be made deeper than they are. But like Bright is a character who tries to distract from his own immortality, unlike his most people distracting from their own mortality. But he tries to focus on anything that's not his constant aging, which is why he does stuff that seems crazy on its surface and in the moment are highly destructive, but in the long term, which is mainly what he's focused on, it's good for the society. um, he is in it like an insane burst of chaotic energy. But at the end of the day, organization knows that he's good for the SCP society. Same goes for Kondraki, but in a very different way. Kondraki is an innovator. He wants to weaponize SCPs. He finds out ways for SCPs to be used against other SCPs. He is a mad genius who doesn't work well with others, but he still gets things done. Same goes with Clef. And these aspects of their characters make them useful. It's why they're still around. They're not just zany, wacky people who do whatever they want. They're actual human beings who are broken and warped by the SCPs that they've come encountered with and the other individuals in the SCP organization. It's what makes them interesting. But it's hard to encapsulate exactly who they are in like a big story with multiple ones of them. The best stories about their individual characters are ones about them as individuals, which is why the custodian Woodworth story and Dr. Bright like works so well. It's because it's simply focusing on one aspect of who Bright is and why he does the things he does. It's not a joke. It's just expressing who he is in a story format that really paints a clear picture on why Bright is who he is, or in that story, why he was who he was.
Yeah, another thing is that just because a character is a jokey character doesn't mean that they can't be written seriously or have a serious story. Because there are a lot of things with Deadpool that are
Yeah,
like very serious.
Gintama and both One Punch Man also have this.
Yeah, it's just like just because you write a wacky character doesn't mean you can't do serious things with them. Because you have to like this is great way to write a great way to write a wacky character in the vein of One Punch Man. One Punch Man is not a he's a purposely silly character, but the thing is he's not a purposely silly character in his world. Like that dude is just ridiculously strong and therefore he doesn't take anything seriously. But aside from that, he's just like a guy who's bored and depressed,
Yes,
you know.
because you
But
can't
to us,
find that challenge anymore.
exactly, and to us, it's funny when he wrecks people in like one hit. But to him, it's just like is another thing that just goes down the drain, and it's like, wow, that really does suck. Uh, because, but yeah, it's stuff like that where I think it works the best. Where it's like there's a reason for why they're wacky and zany, and so half the time it's just like I'm wacky and zany because I'm trying to distract from something that is wrong with me. That's usually the archetype they go. Not a bad one. I wouldn't even say overused half the time. It's just like really, really, really common.
Like
And so
even
yeah,
just putting Clef into a fucking like search bar on the site. Like some of these stories are just like too ridiculous to be real. Like Clef goes to the DMV, Clef eats ass the musical. Like it's just kind of ridiculous. Like the serious
yeah,
ones just get overshadowed by ones that are just meaningless. And sure, it's funny to read about it, but it doesn't highlight what's great about these characters. Anywho, I feel like we're just going to continue repeating ourselves if we continue down this line. And we already have like a solid amount of content to go off of. So I think we should start wrapping it up.
yeah, yeah. That would definitely, yeah, makes sense.
So for our
Because at this
next
point we are
episode,
just repeating ourselves.
yeah. For our next episode, I think we're going to be doing a bunch more individual SCPs. Maybe we'll talk about like I don't know 4 or 5, whatever we have time for, and then uh, maybe do that for a couple of episodes or something, and then we'll go back to I don't know. Maybe we'll do another Doctor. It's whatever. We could continue reading stuff about Dr. Bright or look at individual stories. But I think for next episode we'll definitely be going back to individual SCPs because I really want to talk about the Plague Doctor. He's one of my favorites, and I think he deserves some light shown on him.
Makes sense. You know, and the Plague Doctor is pretty famous too.
Yeah, because he's from the original SCP Containment Breach.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's everything we need to say. Thank you guys for watching. If you like this, leave a like on the video, and tune in next time. You can subscribe if you want to get notified, and hit the bell if you want to get doubly notified. Yeah, Q-Sean's links will be in the description below. As well as the link to SCP-166, and we'll do the link to what's called SCP-166 Mother, if I can pull it up real quick.
Yeah, bro, check out my dead channel.
Yeah. But yeah, that's it for today. Yeah, sorry. We'll put the link for the goddess in the thing. Threat entity 9927-black. And that's it for today. Thank you guys for watching, and see you in the next one. Bye-bye.